The sound of a hammer striking bone echoes through the Kansas prairie. Behind a canvas curtain, shadows dance as a family of 4 moves with practiced precision. 11 graves lay hidden beneath their floorboards. But tonight, there will be 12. The autumn wind of 1871 carried the scent of approaching winter across the endless Kansas prairie, where the Osage Trail stretched like a dusty ribbon toward the horizon. Along this desolate route, where travelers could ride for days without seeing another soul, stood a modest log cabin with a hand-painted sign that read, "Groceries," in faded letters. Inside the cabin, Kate Bender stood behind the crude wooden counter, her dark eyes scanning the empty trail through the single window. At 24, she possessed an unsettling beauty, pale skin that seemed to glow in the lamplight, raven black hair pulled severely back, and lips that curved into smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The locals whispered that she could speak to the dead, that she possessed gifts beyond mortal understanding. "Another day, another dollar," she murmured in her thick German accent, though no customers had darkened their doorway since dawn. Her father, William Bender, emerged from the back room, his massive frame filling the narrow doorway. His weathered hands, scarred from years of hard labor, gripped a worn hammer, the same hammer he used for repairs around the cabin. His gray beard couldn't hide the cruel set of his mouth, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. "Patience, meine Tochter," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "The trail brings us what we need, when we need it." Ma Bender looked up from her sewing, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Elmira Bender was a woman carved from prairie hardship, angular features, iron gray hair, and hands that had known both tender care and terrible violence. At 60, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned to waste neither time nor motion. "The boy grows restless," she said, nodding toward the corner where John Jr. sat hunched over a wooden crate, his simple mind occupied with arranging and rearranging small stones. At 25, John was a gentle giant with the mental capacity of a child, his massive hands surprisingly delicate as he played with his collection. He was the family's greatest asset and their greatest liability. "John's fine," Kate said, though her voice carried an edge of impatience. "He knows his place." The sound of approaching horses broke the afternoon silence. Kate's head snapped toward the window, her eyes lighting with an predatory gleam. A lone rider approached, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust against the dying light. "Traveler?" she announced, her voice taking on the syrupy sweetness she reserved for guests. "Papa, prepare the room." William nodded, disappearing into the back section of the cabin where a canvas curtain divided the space. The front served as their store and dining area, while the back housed their sleeping quarters, but it was the placement of that curtain that made their terrible work possible. Positioned perfectly to conceal someone standing behind it, hammer raised. The rider dismounted outside, his spurs jingling as he approached the door. Kate smoothed her dress and arranged her features into a welcoming smile. Ma Bender set aside her sewing, while John Jr. continued his innocent play, unaware of the dark ritual about to unfold. "Good evening," Kate called out in English as the door opened, admitting a middle-aged man in a dust-covered traveling coat. "Welcome to our humble establishment. You must be weary from the trail." The man removed his hat, revealing thinning brown hair and kind eyes. "Indeed I am, miss. Samuel Morrison, traveling to Independence. Heard tell you folks might have a room for the night and perhaps a hot meal?" "Of course, Mr. Morrison," Kate purred, gesturing to the rough-hewn table positioned strategically in the center of the room. "Please sit. Ma will prepare something special for you." As Morrison settled into the chair facing away from the curtain, Kate caught her father's eye. William's position was perfect, directly behind the unsuspecting traveler, hidden by the canvas barrier. The man's back was to him, neck exposed, vulnerable. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison," Kate said, moving to light another oil lamp. "What brings you through our little corner of Kansas? Business? Family?" Morrison's face softened. "My daughter's wedding in Independence, first grandchild on the way, and I promised I'd be there to walk her down the aisle." He pulled out a small daguerreotype, showing it to Kate with obvious pride. "Mary Elizabeth. She's the light of my life." Kate's smile never wavered, though something flickered in her dark eyes. "How wonderful. You must be so proud." Behind the curtain, William raised his hammer, the weight of it familiar in his scarred hands. The ritual was always the same. A single, precise blow to the base of the skull, followed by Kate's knife across the throat to ensure silence. Quick, efficient, profitable. But as Morrison continued talking about his daughter, describing her laugh and her kind heart, John Jr. looked up from his stones. The simple man's face scrunched in confusion as he watched his father's shadow through the thin canvas. "Papa," John Jr. said, his childlike voice cutting through the warm atmosphere, "what are you doing?" The hammer paused in William's grip. Morrison turned in his chair, following John Jr.'s gaze to the curtain where a large shadow was clearly visible, arm raised in an unmistakable threatening gesture. For a moment the cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of prairie wind. Morrison's eyes widened as understanding dawned, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. "Now, Papa," Kate hissed, but the moment of surprise was lost. Morrison rolled sideways as the hammer crashed down, splintering the wooden table where his head had been moments before. The traveling man's gun cleared leather with surprising speed for someone his age, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoing through the small space. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed, his weapon trained on William, who stood frozen with his hammer raised. "You're the ones they've been whispering about in the towns." Kate's mask of hospitality had completely fallen away, revealing the cold predator beneath. "You should have stayed on the trail, Mr. Morrison." "How many?" Morrison demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "How many travelers have you murdered?" Ma Bender stood slowly, her sewing scissors glinting in the lamplight. "More than you can count, stranger, and you'll be joining them soon enough." But Morrison was already backing toward the door, his gun moving between the three adults. John Jr. remained in his corner, rocking back and forth and whimpering, confused by the sudden violence. "The law will hear about this," Morrison said, his back against the cabin door. "Every sheriff from here to Kansas City will know what you've done." Kate laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The law? Out here? You're 3 days from the nearest town, Mr. Morrison. Who's going to believe the ravings of a man who never arrives at his destination?" Morrison's hand found the door handle, but as he prepared to flee, his eyes met John Jr.'s across the room. The simple man's face was filled with genuine distress, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," John Jr. whispered, and something in his voice made Morrison pause. "I'm so sorry for what they do." The momentary hesitation cost Morrison his life. Ma Bender's scissors found their mark between his shoulder blades and he collapsed forward, his unfired gun clattering across the wooden floor. Kate was on him in an instant, her knife completing the grim work. But as Morrison's life ebbed away, his final words were a promise. She'll come looking. Mary Elizabeth, she'll come." William stood over the body, his hammer still dripping. "One more for the orchard," he said matter-of-factly. "John, help me carry him out back." But John Jr. remained huddled in his corner, his simple mind struggling to process what had just happened. "The man had a daughter," he said softly. "She's getting married." "The man was a fool," Kate replied, cleaning her knife on Morrison's coat. "Just like all the others." As father and son carried the body toward the back door, Kate walked to the window and peered out at the empty prairie. Somewhere out there, Mary Elizabeth Morrison was preparing for her wedding, waiting for a father who would never come. And somewhere else, other travelers were making their way along the Osage Trail, unaware of the hungry darkness that awaited them at the modest cabin with the groceries sign. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and causing the canvas curtain to flutter like a ghostly banner. Kate smiled to herself, already planning improvements for their next guest. The hammer method was effective, but perhaps they needed to be more careful about positioning, more precise. After all, they had a reputation to maintain. Outside, the Kansas prairie stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, keeping its secrets buried deep in the rich, dark soil. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the surface when you least expect them. Winter descended on the Kansas prairie like a shroud, bringing with it howling winds and snow that transformed the landscape into a desolate wasteland. The Bender cabin stood isolated against the elements, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that promised shelter to any traveler brave enough to venture out in such weather. Inside, the family had settled into their deadly routine with practiced efficiency. The wooden floor near the dining table bore dark stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and the canvas curtain had been reinforced with additional support beams to better conceal William's imposing frame. Kate stood at her usual position behind the counter, but her demeanor had changed since the Morrison incident. Her eyes held a new wariness, and she'd taken to keeping a loaded derringer hidden beneath her apron. The close call had shaken her more than she cared to admit. 17, she murmured, running her finger along the grain of the wooden counter. 17 souls have passed through our door. Ma Bender looked up from her ledger where she meticulously recorded each victim's possessions and their estimated worth. 18, she corrected. You're forgetting the cavalry deserter from last month. The boy doesn't count, Kate replied dismissively. He had nothing worth taking. William emerged from the back room, his massive hands black with soil. The ground's getting harder to dig, he announced, frost setting in deeper than usual. The family had long since run out of space in their small orchard behind the cabin. What had started as a modest apple grove now concealed a sprawling cemetery of unmarked graves. William had become an expert at maximizing the space, sometimes placing multiple bodies in a single plot. John Jr. sat in his corner, but his usual innocent play had been replaced by a disturbing new habit. He'd begun collecting items from their victims, a pocket watch here, a worn photograph there, and arranging them in elaborate patterns on the floor. The simple man seemed to derive comfort from these morbid trophies, though he couldn't articulate why. "John," Ma Bender said sharply, noticing her son's latest arrangement. "Put those things away. We've discussed this." "But they're pretty," John Jr. protested, his childlike voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "The lady in the picture looks like an angel." Kate glanced over at the photograph John Jr. was caressing, a young woman in a wedding dress, her smile radiant with joy. It belonged to a merchant they'd killed 2 weeks prior, a man who'd been traveling to his niece's wedding with a bag full of silver dollars. "Angels don't exist, John," Kate said coldly. "Only the living and the dead." The sound of approaching horses broke the evening quiet. Kate's head snapped toward the window, her predatory instincts immediately alert, but what she saw made her blood run cold. 3 riders approached through the swirling snow, their horses' breath steaming in the frigid air. Even through the darkness, Kate could make out the distinctive silhouettes of law enforcement, badges glinting on their coats, rifles secured to their saddles. "Lawman," she hissed, her hand instinctively moving to the derringer beneath her apron. William was beside her in an instant, his pale eyes scanning the approaching riders. "How many?" 3, maybe more behind them in the snow. Ma Bender stood slowly, her aged joints protesting the sudden movement. "The Morrison girl," she said grimly. "She made good on her father's promise." The family exchanged glances loaded with unspoken communication. They'd always known this day might come, and they'd prepared accordingly. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in the back room were go-bags containing money, weapons, and enough supplies to disappear into the wilderness. "John," William commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute obedience. "Get the bags. Now." John Jr. looked up from his collection, confusion evident on his simple features. "Are we going somewhere, Papa?" "Just get the bags, son." The riders were close enough now that Kate could make out their faces. The man in the lead was Sheriff Briggs from Oswego, his weathered features set in grim determination. Behind him rode 2 deputies, their young faces tense with the gravity of their mission. "They're not here for groceries," Kate muttered, her mind racing through their options. Fight, flight, or deception. Each carried its own risks. Ma Bender moved to the window, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the approaching lawman. "The one in back, he's got a Henry rifle. Military bearing, could be a problem." William nodded, his scarred hands already reaching for the shotgun hidden beneath the counter. "Kate, you handle the talking. Ma, watch the back door." "John, I know what to do, Papa." The horses stopped outside the cabin, and the 3 lawmen dismounted with practiced efficiency. Sheriff Briggs approached the door while his deputies flanked the windows, their movements coordinated and professional. Kate quickly arranged her features into a mask of innocent concern, smoothing her dress and adopting the posture of a worried frontier woman. When the knock came, she was ready. "Good evening, officers," she said, opening the door just wide enough to peer out. Terrible weather to be traveling. Is something wrong? Sheriff Briggs touched the brim of his hat politely, but his eyes were hard as flint. Evening, Miss Bender. I'm Sheriff Briggs, and these are my deputies. We're investigating the disappearance of several travelers along this route. Disappearances? Kate's voice carried just the right note of alarm. How terrible. Please come in out of the cold. The sheriff stepped inside, his experienced gaze immediately taking in the layout of the cabin. His eyes lingered on the canvas curtain, the positioned dining table, and the dark stains on the wooden floor. We're particularly interested in a man named Samuel Morrison, Briggs continued, removing his hat but keeping his coat buttoned. He was traveling to Independence for his daughter's wedding. Never arrived. Kate's expression was perfect, just the right mixture of concern and helpfulness. Morrison, the name sounds familiar. Ma, didn't a gentleman by that name stop here a while back? Ma Bender nodded, her own performance flawless. Indeed he did. Lovely man. Spoke fondly of his daughter. Had a meal and stayed the night, then continued on his way. When was this? Deputy Collins asked, his notebook already out. Oh, must have been 2 months ago now, Kate replied. Time moves differently out here on the prairie. Sheriff Briggs walked slowly around the cabin, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He paused at the dining table, running his fingers along the deep gouge Morrison's chair had made when he'd rolled away from William's hammer. Interesting mark, the sheriff observed. Recent? Clumsy of me, Kate said with a self-deprecating laugh. Dropped a heavy pot last week. I keep meaning to sand it out. But Briggs wasn't convinced. His years of law enforcement had taught him to read the subtle signs of deception, and everything about this cabin screamed danger. The positioning of the furniture, the nervous energy of the occupants, the way John Jr. huddled in his corner, clutching something in his hands. Mind if we search the premises? Briggs asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. Of course not, Kate replied, her smile never wavering, though I'm not sure what you expect to find. As the deputies began their search, Sheriff Briggs continued his conversation with Kate, but his attention was increasingly drawn to John Jr. The simple man was rocking back and forth, something glinting in his closed fist. John, Briggs said gently, approaching the corner. What do you have there, son? John Jr. looked up with frightened eyes, then at his father, then back at the sheriff. His simple mind was clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties. Nothing, John Jr. whispered. Just stones. Can I see? William stepped forward, his massive frame imposing. The boy's simple, Sheriff. Gets confused easily. Best to leave him be. But Briggs had dealt with all manner of criminals in his career, and he recognized the signs of a family conspiracy. He held out his hand to John Jr., his voice remaining gentle but firm. It's okay, John. You're not in trouble. John Jr.'s resolve crumbled. With trembling fingers, he opened his fist to reveal Samuel Morrison's gold pocket watch, its surface engraved with the words, "To my beloved father, with love, Mary Elizabeth." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Sheriff Briggs took the watch carefully, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing it from the description provided by Morrison's daughter. Where did you get this, John? Briggs asked quietly. The man gave it to me, John Jr. said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Papa hit him with the hammer, the words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kate's hand moved toward her hidden derringer, but Deputy Collins was faster, his Colt already drawn and trained on her. Don't, Collins warned. Hands where I can see them. William made a desperate lunge for his shotgun, but Deputy Harrison was ready. The younger man's rifle cracked once, and William Bender crashed to the floor, his massive frame shaking the entire cabin. Papa! John Jr. screamed, his simple mind finally understanding the gravity of what was happening. Ma Bender stood frozen, her calculating mind working through their rapidly diminishing options. The law had found them, their killing ground had been discovered, and now they were trapped like animals in a cage. It's over, Sheriff Briggs said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. All of you, hands on your heads. But Kate Bender wasn't finished. With a movement born of desperation, she grabbed the oil lamp from the counter and hurled it at the canvas curtain. The flames caught immediately, the dry fabric blazing like a torch. If we burn, we all burn, she screamed, her mask of sanity finally slipping completely. The cabin erupted into chaos. The deputies shouted orders as the fire spread rapidly up the walls. John Jr. crawled toward his fallen father, his simple mind unable to process the violence and destruction surrounding him. Through the smoke and flames, Kate made her move. She burst through the back door into the swirling snow, her dark dress a shadow against the white landscape. Ma Bender followed, her aged legs carrying her faster than seemed possible. Sheriff Briggs and his deputies faced a terrible choice: pursue the fleeing killers or save John Jr. from the burning cabin. Their training dictated they save the innocent, even if he was part of the murderous family. "Get the boy," Briggs shouted, grabbing John Jr. under the arms and dragging him toward the door. They emerged into the frigid night just as the cabin's roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. The heat was intense even in the freezing air, and the smoke could be seen for miles across the prairie. "Where did they go?" Deputy Collins asked, his eyes scanning the snowy landscape. Sheriff Briggs pointed toward the horizon where two dark figures were disappearing into the storm. "They won't get far in this weather. We'll track them at first light." But as the lawmen watched, the figures seemed to fade into the swirling snow like ghosts, leaving no trace of their passage. The Kansas prairie had swallowed Kate and Ma Bender as completely as if they'd never existed. John Jr. sat in the snow, watching his childhood home burn to the ground. His simple mind couldn't understand why his family had hurt so many people, or why they'd had to run away. All he knew was that the pretty things he'd collected were gone, consumed by the hungry flames. "My stones," he whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks. "All my pretty stones." Sheriff Briggs knelt beside the simple man, his hardened heart moved by the genuine sorrow in John Jr.'s voice. "We'll find you new stones, son. Different ones. Better ones." As the cabin burned through the night, the wind carried the smoke and ash across the prairie, scattering the remains of the Bender family's terrible legacy. But somewhere in the darkness, two figures pressed on through the storm, leaving behind them a trail of unanswered questions that would haunt the Kansas territory for generations to come. The fire had consumed the evidence, but the stories would live forever. Dawn broke gray and cold over the smoldering ruins of the Bender cabin, the skeletal remains of timber and stone jutting from the snow like blackened teeth. Sheriff Briggs stood among the ashes, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed the destruction. What they'd found beneath the floorboards would haunt him for the rest of his days. 11 bodies, Deputy Collins reported, his young face pale with shock. "Maybe more. The fire damaged some of the remains pretty badly." Briggs nodded grimly, his experienced eyes taking in the makeshift cemetery that had been hidden beneath the Bender cabin. The bodies were in various states of decay, some recent, others clearly months old. Each showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, followed by knife wounds to the throat. "Professional work," he muttered, kneeling beside one of the better-preserved corpses. They'd done this before, many times. John Jr. sat on a fallen log 20 yards away, wrapped in a deputy's coat and staring at the ruins of his former home. The simple man had been cooperative since his capture, answering questions with childlike honesty that painted a horrifying picture of systematic murder. "John," Briggs called gently, "can you tell me again where your Ma and Kate might have gone?" John Jr. looked up with confused eyes. "They don't tell me things," he said softly. "I just play with my stones and help Papa dig holes. But you must have heard them talking about places they wanted to visit, people they knew." The simple man shook his head. "Ma says I talk too much. She says I should keep my mouth shut about family business." Deputy Harrison approached, his boots crunching through the snow. "Found something interesting, Sheriff." He held up a partially burned ledger, its pages charred but still legible. "Looks like they kept records." Briggs took the book carefully, his eyes scanning the meticulous entries. Ma Bender had documented each victim with businesslike precision. Names, dates, possessions taken, estimated value. The ledger read like a merchant's inventory, except the merchandise was human lives. Morrison Samuel, October 15th, gold watch, $47 in coins, silver belt buckle. Buried West Orchard, 3rd row, Briggs read aloud. Henderson Marcus, September 3rd, horse, saddle, $23, leather boots, buried East Orchard, 1st row. Jesus Christ. The entries went back nearly 2 years. documenting a spree of murder that had claimed dozens of lives. But it was the final entry that made Briggs's blood run cold. Preparation for departure, northern route planned, contacts in Minnesota territory confirmed, Jay to be disposed of if necessary. The sheriff looked up at John Jr., understanding dawning in his eyes. The family had been planning to abandon their killing ground, and they'd been prepared to murder their own son to eliminate loose ends. They were going to kill him, Deputy Collins said quietly, their own blood. Evil doesn't recognize family bonds, Briggs replied. These people were monsters, plain and simple. A rider approached from the east, his horse's hooves drumming against the frozen ground. Sheriff Briggs recognized him immediately. Tom Bradley, a fellow lawman from Thayer County who'd been tracking missing persons cases throughout the region. "Briggs!" Bradley called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Heard about the fire. Are they—" "2 of them got away," Briggs confirmed. "Kate and the old woman. We have the son, but he's simple." Bradley's face darkened. "Damn. I've got reports of similar disappearances all along the territorial routes. If it's the same people, they've been at this for years. How many missing?" 23 confirmed in my territory alone. Could be more." The scope of the Bender family's crimes was staggering. They'd turned their modest cabin into a charnel house, systematically murdering travelers for their possessions and burying the evidence in their backyard orchard. The operation had been so efficient, so carefully planned, that they'd operated for years without detection. "We need to organize a proper manhunt," Briggs decided. "Wire every sheriff's office from here to the Canadian border, circulate descriptions of the women, put bounties on their heads." "What about the boy?" Bradley asked, nodding toward John Jr. "He'll stand trial, but his condition will be taken into account. The real monsters are still out there." As the lawmen discussed their plans, John Jr. wandered closer to the ruins of his former home. His simple mind was struggling to process the destruction, the bodies, the sudden absence of his family. He'd lived his entire life in that cabin, and now it was gone, reduced to ash and memory. "My stones," he whispered, kneeling in the snow where his corner had been. "All my pretty stones." Something glinted in the ash, a fragment of metal that had survived the fire. John Jr. picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing away the soot. It was a brass button, probably from one of their victims' coats. But to John Jr., it was just another pretty thing to add to his collection. "They left me," he said softly, the reality of abandonment finally sinking in. "Mama and Kate left me." Sheriff Briggs approached, his hardened features softening with unexpected compassion. "They weren't good people, John. What they did was wrong, but they were my family. Sometimes family can hurt you worse than strangers. You're better off without them." John Jr. looked up with innocent eyes that had seen too much horror. "Will you help me find new stones, pretty ones?" The simple question nearly broke Briggs's heart. Here was a man who'd been part of one of the most brutal killing sprees in territorial history, and all he wanted was to collect pretty rocks. The contrast between his innocence and the evil that had surrounded him was almost too much to bear. "I'll see what I can do," Briggs promised. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the Bender family's operation. They'd targeted lone travelers, particularly those carrying significant amounts of money or valuable possessions. The cabin's location on the Osage Trail made it a perfect hunting ground, isolated enough to avoid detection, but positioned to catch travelers heading to and from the developing settlements. Kate had used her supposed psychic abilities to lure victims, claiming she could contact their dead relatives or predict their future. Ma Bender had played the role of the kindly frontier matron, offering home-cooked meals and warm beds to weary travelers. William had been the muscle, delivering the killing blow from behind the canvas curtain while his victims sat unsuspecting at their dining table. But it was the systematic nature of their crimes that truly disturbed the investigating lawmen. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. It was cold-blooded murder conducted with the efficiency of a business operation. "They had it down to a science," Deputy Collins observed, studying the positioning of the dining table and curtain. "Victim sits here, back to the curtain. Killer stands here, hammer raised. One blow to the base of the skull, then the knife across the throat to make sure. And then what? They just buried the body and waited for the next victim?" According to the ledger, they'd sometimes wait weeks between murders. Depends on the traffic along the trail. The investigation was yielding crucial information, but time was working against them. Kate and Ma Bender had a significant head start, and the harsh winter weather was making tracking nearly impossible. The two women could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius, and every hour that passed increased their chances of escaping justice. "We need to think like them," Briggs said, studying a territorial map spread across a makeshift table. "They're not just running, they're running to something. Somewhere they feel safe." Deputy Harrison pointed to the Northern Territories. The ledger mentioned contacts in Minnesota. Could be family, could be partners. Or it could be misdirection, Bradley countered. "If I was planning to disappear, I'd leave false clues about my destination." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of another group of riders, a posse of local men led by Dr. William York, a prominent physician from nearby Independence. York's brother, Colonel Alexander York, had been among the Bender family's victims, and the doctor's face showed the strain of both grief and determination. "Sheriff Briggs," York called out, dismounting with barely controlled urgency. "I've come to join the hunt. Dr. York, I'm sorry for your loss." York's jaw was set in grim determination. Alexander was a good man, a family man. He deserved better than to die like an animal in that slaughterhouse. "We'll find them," Briggs promised. "Justice will be served." "Justice?" York's laugh was bitter. "Justice would be those murdering bitches swinging from the nearest tree. But I'll settle for seeing them in chains." The arrival of the York posse brought the manhunt party to nearly 30 men, all armed and mounted, all driven by a thirst for vengeance that ran deeper than professional duty. The Bender family's crimes had touched too many lives, destroyed too many families for this to be just another criminal investigation. "They can't have gotten far," York insisted, his physician's logical mind working through the possibilities. "Two women on foot in this weather. They'll need shelter, food, transportation." "Unless they had help," Briggs said grimly. "The ledger suggests they had contacts throughout the territory." As the manhunt prepared to begin in earnest, John Jr. sat forgotten on his log, clutching his brass button and staring at the ruins of his former life. The simple man couldn't understand why everyone was so angry, why they wanted to hurt his mama and Kate. In his childlike mind, they were still his family, still the people who'd fed him and given him a place to sleep. But somewhere in the depths of his simple consciousness, John Jr. knew his family had done terrible things. He'd seen the fear in the travelers' eyes, heard their final screams, felt the weight of their bodies as he'd helped his father carry them to their shallow graves. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the wind, his words carried away across the endless prairie. "I'm sorry for all the pretty stones we took from the people who couldn't keep them anymore." The manhunt for Kate and Ma Bender would become one of the largest in territorial history, involving dozens of lawmen and hundreds of volunteers. But as the sun set on that cold December day, the two most wanted women in Kansas were already far from the smoking ruins of their killing ground, disappearing into the vast wilderness like ghosts from a nightmare. The hunt was just beginning. 3 weeks after the discovery of the Bender cabin's horrific secrets, the manhunt had evolved into something approaching a military campaign. Sheriff Briggs commanded a force of 60 men spread across 5 counties, with telegraph lines buzzing constantly between law enforcement offices throughout the territory. Every train depot, every river crossing, every frontier town had been alerted to watch for 2 women matching the descriptions of Kate and Ma Bender. But the Kansas prairie was vast, and winter was proving to be their greatest ally. In the town of Parsons, 40 miles north of the burned cabin, Sheriff Briggs studied the latest reports by lamplight in the local jail. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, his face gaunt from weeks of relentless pursuit. The investigation had consumed him, driven him to the edge of obsession. "Nothing," he muttered, throwing down a telegram from Topeka. 3 weeks and they've vanished like smoke. Deputy Collins entered the office, his boots tracking snow across the wooden floor. "Got word from the railroad station, Sheriff. The station master in Coffeyville thinks he might have seen them boarding the northbound train 2 nights ago." Briggs looked up with renewed interest. "Thinks?" 2 women in heavy coats traveling together. Kept their faces covered, paid in cash. "Could be them. Could be anyone trying to get out of this weather. Send a wire to every station between here and Kansas City. If they're on that train, we'll find them." But even as he issued the orders, Briggs felt the familiar weight of doubt. The Bender women had proven themselves to be cunning survivors, capable of planning and executing a murder spree that had lasted nearly 2 years. They wouldn't make obvious mistakes now. Dr. York entered the office, his face drawn with exhaustion and barely contained fury. The physician had thrown himself into the manhunt with the fervor of a man possessed, spending his own money to fund search parties and offering increasingly substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of his brother's killers. "Any word from the Minnesota contacts?" York asked, settling into a chair across from Briggs's desk. "Dead end. The names in the ledger were aliases. No records of anyone by those names in the territory." York's fist clenched on his knee. "They planned this. Every detail, every contingency. These weren't random killers, they were professionals." "That's what scares me," Briggs admitted. "Professional killers don't just stop, they relocate and start again." 50 miles to the east, in a small boarding house in the town of Girard, 2 women sat in a dimly lit room, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single candle. They'd been there for 3 days, waiting for the heat to die down, planning their next move. Kate Bender had aged years in the weeks since their escape. Her once pristine appearance had given way to the haggard look of a fugitive. Unwashed hair, hollow cheeks, eyes that darted constantly toward the windows. But the predatory intelligence remained, perhaps sharpened by desperation. "The trains are being watched," she said, her German accent more pronounced under stress. "Every station from here to the border." Ma Bender sat across from her, methodically cleaning a small pistol she'd acquired from a drunk cowboy in the boarding house's common room. At 65, she'd adapted to life on the run with remarkable resilience, her frontier upbringing serving her well in their current circumstances. "Then we don't take the trains," Ma replied matter-of-factly. "We go overland, find a wagon, some horses. There are ways. And John?" For the first time since their escape, Ma Bender's composed facade cracked slightly. "John made his choice when he talked to the law. He's dead to us now." Kate studied her mother's face, searching for any sign of regret or maternal feeling. She found none. The woman who'd raised her was as cold and calculating as ever, viewing even her own son as expendable in the face of survival. "The bounty's up to $500 each," Kate said, having overheard conversations in the boarding house's common room. "Every bounty hunter and desperate fool in 3 territories is looking for us. Let them look. We've disappeared before. That was different. We had time to plan, resources to draw on. Now we're running blind." Ma Bender finished cleaning her pistol and tucked it into her skirt. "Then we make new plans, find new resources. Adapt or die, Kate. It's the frontier way." A knock at their door made both women freeze. Kate's hand moved instinctively to the knife hidden in her boot, while Ma Bender's fingers found the grip of her pistol. "Yes?" Kate called out, affecting a weak, sickly voice. "Mrs. Smith? It's Mrs. Patterson, the landlady. I have your supper." The women exchanged glances. They'd been using the names Mary and Sarah Smith, claiming to be sisters traveling to California for Mary's health. It was a common enough story on the frontier, and the landlady had seemed to believe it. Kate opened the door just wide enough to accept the tray of food. Mrs. Patterson was a matronly woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a genuine concern for her guests' welfare. "How are you feeling, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, peering past Kate into the dimly lit room. "You've barely left this room since you arrived." "The consumption," Kate replied weakly, covering her mouth with a handkerchief. "The doctor says rest is the only cure." "Of course, I'll pray for your recovery." As the landlady departed, Kate closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. The close scrutiny, the constant fear of discovery, it was wearing her down faster than she'd expected. "How long can we keep this up?" she asked. "As long as necessary," Ma Bender replied, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Back in Parsons, the investigation had taken a disturbing turn. John Jr. had been transferred to the county jail, where his childlike demeanor and obvious mental limitations had made him something of a curiosity. Local newspapers had begun running stories about the simple son of the Bender butchers, portraying him as both victim and accomplice in his family's crimes. Sheriff Briggs found himself oddly protective of the simple man, ensuring he was treated with dignity despite the horrific nature of his family's crimes. John Jr. had provided valuable information about the family's operations, but his testimony would be crucial in any future trials. "Sheriff," John Jr. said one evening, his voice carrying the hesitant tone of someone unsure of their welcome. "Can I ask you something?" Briggs looked up from his paperwork. "Of course, John. Are Mama and Kate bad people?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. How do you explain the concept of evil to someone with the mental capacity of a child? How do you make them understand that the people they loved were monsters? They hurt people, John. They killed people who didn't deserve to die. But they were nice to me. They fed me and gave me a place to sleep. Sometimes bad people can be nice to some folks and terrible to others. It doesn't make them good people. John Jr. nodded slowly, his simple mind working through the complex moral concepts. I helped them hurt people. Does that make me bad too? Briggs felt his throat tighten. No, John. You didn't understand what you were doing. That's different. I want to be good now. I want to help the people they hurt. You are helping. By telling the truth, by being honest about what happened. That's how you make things right. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegraph operator, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff, priority message from Junction City." Briggs tore open the telegram, his eyes scanning the brief message. As he read, his expression shifted from hope to grim determination. "What is it?" Deputy Collins asked. "They found bodies, fresh ones. 2 women traveling together, murdered for their money and possessions. The killer used a hammer to the skull, then cut their throats." The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications immediately. The Bender women hadn't just escaped, they'd resumed their killing spree. "Same method, same signature," Briggs continued. "They're not just running, they're hunting." Dr. York, who'd been dozing in a chair by the fire, sat up with renewed alertness. "Where?" "Junction City, 3 days ago. The bodies were found this morning. That's 60 miles north of here. They're heading for the border." Briggs was already reaching for his coat. "Collins, organize a posse. 20 good men, fast horses. We ride within the hour." As the lawmen prepared for another leg of their relentless pursuit, John Jr. sat in his cell, staring out at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, his family continued their bloody work, leaving a trail of bodies across the Kansas territory. The simple man couldn't understand the complex motivations that drove them, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would never stop killing until someone stopped them. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the night wind. "I'm sorry for all the people they're going to hurt." The manhunt was about to enter its most dangerous phase. The Bender women were cornered, desperate, and had nothing left to lose. They'd proven they could kill without hesitation, plan without error, and disappear without a trace. But Sheriff Briggs and his men were equally determined. The hunt would continue across state lines if necessary, until justice was served or the hunters became the hunted. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of escape, or the sound of approaching doom. The February wind howled across the Kansas prairie like the voices of the damned, carrying with it the scent of snow and something darker, the metallic tang of blood that seemed to follow the Bender women wherever they went. Sheriff Briggs and his posse had been riding hard for 6 hours, following a trail that grew fresher with each mile. 3 more bodies had been discovered since Junction City. A traveling preacher found with his skull crushed outside Abilene. A merchant and his wife discovered in their overturned wagon near Salina, their throats cut and their goods scattered across the frozen ground. The kills were becoming more frequent, more desperate, as if the hunted had become the hunters once again. "They're not just running anymore," Deputy Collins observed, his horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. "They're feeding." Sheriff Briggs nodded grimly, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. "Like wolves in winter. The more desperate they get, the more dangerous they become." The posse had grown to nearly 40 men, a mix of lawmen, bounty hunters, and volunteers driven by a thirst for justice that bordered on vigilantism. Dr. York rode at the front of the group, his physician's bag replaced by a Winchester rifle and a rope that he'd made no secret of wanting to use. "When we find them," York said, his voice carrying across the wind, "I want them taken alive. They need to answer for what they've done." "And if they resist?" asked Tom Bradley, the sheriff from Thayer County. "Then we do what needs to be done." The trail led them northeast toward the Missouri border and the promise of escape that lay beyond. But the Bender women had made a crucial mistake in their latest killing. They'd taken the merchant's distinctive wagon, a bright red prairie schooner that stood out like a beacon against the white landscape. There, Collins pointed toward a distant ridge, smoke. Through the swirling snow, they could see a thin column of smoke rising from a small grove of cottonwood trees. It was the kind of temporary camp that desperate fugitives might make, hidden from the main trail but close enough to watch for approaching danger. Briggs raised his hand, signaling the posse to halt. "We go in quiet. Surround the camp. Give them no avenue of escape." The men dismounted, checking their weapons and spreading out in a wide circle around the grove. Years of frontier experience had taught them the value of patience and positioning. The Bender women might be skilled killers, but they were still just 2 people against 40. As they moved through the snow, Briggs couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The smoke was too obvious, the camp too exposed. After weeks of near supernatural evasion, why would the women suddenly become careless? His question was answered when they reached the grove. The red wagon sat in the center of the clearing, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the wind. But it was empty except for the frozen corpses of 2 women, their faces unrecognizable from the brutal beating they'd received before death. "Jesus Christ," Collins breathed, his voice barely audible over the wind. Sheriff Briggs approached the wagon carefully, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. The women had been killed with the same method the Benders used, hammer blows to the skull, followed by knife wounds to the throat. But these weren't random victims. The clothes, the hair, the approximate ages, everything suggested that Kate and Ma Bender had found 2 women who resembled them closely enough to serve as decoys. "It's not them," Briggs said, his voice heavy with disappointment and renewed respect for their quarry's cunning. "They killed these women and left them here to throw us off the trail." Dr. York's face contorted with rage. "How long?" "Judging by the state of the bodies, maybe 2 days. They've got a significant head start." "Then we keep hunting. With what trail? They could be anywhere by now." The realization hit the posse like a physical blow. After weeks of relentless pursuit, they'd been outmaneuvered by their quarry once again. The Bender women had bought themselves precious time by sacrificing 2 innocent lives, time they'd used to disappear completely. But as the men stood around the wagon, discussing their next move, none of them noticed the 2 figures watching from a distant hilltop. Kate and Ma Bender had indeed been at the camp, but they'd seen the approaching posse and made their escape on foot, leaving behind the grisly decoys and the stolen wagon. "How many?" Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 40, maybe more," Ma Bender replied, her sharp eyes counting the horses below. "They're serious about this. Too serious. We need to end this." Ma Bender turned to study her daughter's face. Kate had changed during their weeks on the run. Her beauty hardened into something predatory and desperate. The young woman who'd once charmed travelers with her supposed psychic abilities had become a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. "End it how?" "We stop running, we make them come to us on our terms." "That's suicide, Kate." "No, it's strategy. They expect us to keep running, to keep making mistakes. But what if we don't? What if we turn and fight?" Ma Bender considered this, her calculating mind working through the possibilities. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. But they still had advantages: knowledge of the terrain, the element of surprise, and most importantly, the willingness to do things their pursuers wouldn't. "The old mining camp," Ma Bender said suddenly, 10 miles north. "Abandoned for years, but the buildings are still sound." Kate nodded, understanding immediately. "Defensible position, multiple escape routes, and far enough off the main trail that we can see them coming. It's still suicide." "Maybe, but I'd rather die fighting than running." As the 2 women made their way north through the deepening snow, the posse below continued their investigation of the decoy camp. Sheriff Briggs had found additional evidence of the Benders' presence: scraps of cloth that matched descriptions of their clothing, footprints in the snow that suggested they'd been watching the camp from a distance. "They're still close," he announced to the gathered men. "This whole thing was a trap, a way to buy time while they repositioned." "Then we keep hunting," Dr. York insisted. "Follow every trail, search every building." "In this weather? We'll lose half our men to frostbite." "Then we lose them. But we don't stop until those murdering bitches are dead or in chains." The argument that followed revealed the growing tensions within the posse. Some men wanted to continue the pursuit regardless of the cost, while others argued for a more strategic approach. The Bender women had proven themselves to be formidable adversaries, and chasing them blindly through a Kansas winter was likely to result in more casualties. We split up, Briggs decided finally. Half the men continue the search, the other half return to town to coordinate with other law enforcement agencies. We cast a wider net, used telegraph lines to track their movements. It was a reasonable strategy, but it played directly into the Bender women's hands. By dividing their forces, the lawmen had reduced their effectiveness and given their quarry more opportunities to strike. As night fell over the prairie, Kate and Ma Bender reached the abandoned mining camp. The buildings were in better condition than expected. A main house, a barn, and several outbuildings that had been protected from the elements by their location in a natural depression between two hills. Perfect, Kate said, surveying their new stronghold. We can hold off an army from here, if it comes to that. It will. They'll never stop hunting us, not after what we've done. The only way this ends is if we end it. Ma Bender began checking the buildings for defensibility, her frontier instincts taking over. The main house had thick log walls and small windows that could serve as gun ports. The barn offered an elevated position with a clear view of the surrounding terrain, and the outbuildings provided multiple fallback positions if their primary defenses were breached. We'll need supplies, Ma Bender said. Food, ammunition, medical supplies. Leave that to me, Kate replied, her predatory smile returning. I know where to get what we need. 20 miles south, in the town of Ellsworth, a family of homesteaders was preparing for bed when they heard horses approaching their isolated cabin. The father, a man named Thomas Mitchell, opened the door to find two women standing on his porch, their faces pale with exhaustion and cold. Please, Kate said, her voice weak and desperate, we're lost. Our wagon broke down miles back and we've been walking for hours. Mitchell's wife, Sarah, appeared at his shoulder, her maternal instincts immediately aroused by the sight of the two bedraggled women. Thomas, we can't leave them out in this weather. They'll freeze to death. Of course, Mitchell said, stepping aside to let them enter. Come in. Warm yourselves by the fire. As the two women entered the cabin, Kate's eyes quickly cataloged the contents: food supplies, weapons, warm clothing. Everything they needed to continue their war against the pursuing lawmen. You're very kind, Kate said, settling into a chair by the fire. We're traveling to Missouri to see my sister. She's having a baby, and we wanted to be there for the birth. Dangerous time of year for traveling, Mitchell observed, pouring coffee for his unexpected guests. Yes, but family is family, Ma Bender replied, her grandmotherly demeanor perfectly convincing. We couldn't let her go through it alone. The conversation continued for several minutes, the Mitchell family completely taken in by the women's performance. They had no way of knowing that they were sharing their home with two of the most wanted fugitives in the territory, or that their kindness would be repaid with violence. It was Sarah Mitchell who made the discovery that sealed their fate. While preparing sleeping arrangements for their guests, she found a newspaper clipping in Kate's coat pocket. A detailed description of the Bender women and the crimes they'd committed. Thomas? Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Look at this. Mitchell read the clipping, his face paling as he realized the danger they were in. But when he looked up, Kate was standing in the doorway, her knife already in her hand. I'm sorry, Kate said, her voice devoid of emotion. You weren't supposed to find that. The massacre that followed was swift and brutal. The Mitchell family, Thomas, Sarah, and their two young children, were killed with the same methodical efficiency the Benders had perfected over years of practice. But this time there was no pretense of hospitality, no ritual of the dining table and canvas curtain. This was pure survival killing, desperate and ugly. As dawn broke over the prairie, Kate and Ma Bender loaded their stolen supplies into the Mitchell family's wagon and continued their journey to the mining camp. Behind them, the homestead burned, adding another column of smoke to the winter sky and 4 more names to their growing list of victims. No turning back now, Ma Bender observed, watching the flames consume the evidence of their latest crime. There never was, Kate replied. We've been dead women walking since the moment we started killing. The only question is how many we take with us. The final confrontation was inevitable now. The Bender women had chosen their battlefield, and Sheriff Briggs and his men would come. When they did, the Kansas prairie would witness a reckoning that would be remembered for generations, a battle between justice and evil that could only end in blood. As the stolen wagon carried them toward their final stronghold, Kate Bender smiled for the first time in weeks. She was no longer running from her fate. She was rushing toward it, and she intended to meet it on her own terms. The hunt was about to become a war. Epilogue echoes across time. Spring, 1874. The abandoned mining camp sat silent under the vast Kansas sky, its buildings scarred by bullet holes and blackened by fire. Sheriff Briggs stood among the ruins, his weathered face reflecting the weight of the terrible events that had transpired here 3 months earlier. The final battle had lasted 2 days. Kate and Ma Bender had turned the mining camp into a fortress, using their stolen supplies and superior defensive position to hold off the combined forces of law enforcement and volunteer militia. The siege had become a war of attrition, with both sides taking casualties as the standoff stretched on. In the end, it was fire that decided the outcome. Unable to dislodge the women from their stronghold, the lawmen had resorted to burning them out. The main house had gone up like a torch, its dry timber creating an inferno that could be seen for miles across the prairie. But when the flames died down and the smoke cleared, no bodies were found. "They got away again," Deputy Collins said, kicking at a piece of charred timber. "Even after all that, they still got away." Briggs nodded grimly. In the chaos of the fire, Kate and Ma Bender had somehow escaped through a network of abandoned mine shafts that honeycombed the hill beneath the camp. By the time the pursuing lawmen had discovered the tunnels, the women had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Kansas territory. "The story's already growing," Collins continued. "Newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco are running articles about the phantom killers of Kansas. Some folks are saying they were ghosts all along, that you can't kill what's already dead. They were human," Briggs said firmly. "Evil humans, but human nonetheless. And humans leave traces." But even as he spoke the words, Briggs felt the weight of uncertainty. The Bender women had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to disappear, to reinvent themselves, to stay one step ahead of justice. Their final escape from the mining camp had only added to their dark legend. In the months that followed, reported sightings came from across the frontier. 2 women matching their descriptions were seen boarding a riverboat in St. Louis. A pair of sisters claiming to be traveling to California had been spotted in Colorado territory. A mother and daughter running a boarding house in New Mexico had aroused suspicion when several guests disappeared. Each lead was investigated, each sighting pursued, but none yielded concrete results. The Bender women had become phantoms, existing in the spaces between truth and legend, reality and nightmare. John Jr. had been tried and sentenced to life in prison, his mental limitations earning him mercy from the gallows. He spent his days in a cell in the Kansas State Penitentiary, still collecting small objects and arranging them in patterns that made sense only to him. On quiet nights, he would speak to the walls about his family, wondering aloud if they were still alive, still hurting people somewhere beyond the horizon. "They were good to me," he would say, his simple mind unable to reconcile the love he'd felt from his family with the horror of their crimes. "But they hurt so many people. I don't understand why they had to hurt so many people." Dr. York had never recovered from his brother's murder. The physician had spent his fortune funding the manhunt, bankrupting himself in pursuit of justice that never came. He died in 1875, some said from a broken heart, others from the consumption that had been slowly killing him throughout the pursuit of his brother's killers. The Bender cabin site became a macabre tourist attraction. Thousands of visitors traveled to the remote location, hoping to catch a glimpse of the evil that had flourished there. Souvenir hunters stripped the ruins bare, taking pieces of timber and stone as mementos of the horror. The apple orchard where the victims had been buried was trampled into mud by the crowds of curiosity seekers. But on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right across the prairie, local farmers reported hearing sounds from the direction of the old Bender place. The creak of wagon wheels, the distant sound of voices speaking in German, the echo of laughter that chilled the blood. "They're still out there," old-timers would whisper in the saloons of nearby towns, still traveling the back roads, still looking for the next traveler foolish enough to trust a friendly face. The legend of the Bender family grew with each telling, becoming part of the dark mythology of the American frontier. They were the bogeymen that parents used to frighten children into staying close to home. The cautionary tale that reminded travelers to be wary of strangers offering shelter. In 1889, 15 years after the mining camp siege, a woman claiming to be Kate Bender was arrested in Michigan. She bore a striking resemblance to the wanted posters, and several witnesses swore they recognized her voice and mannerisms. But the woman maintained her innocence, claiming to be a widow named Sarah Davis who had never been west of the Mississippi. The trial became a sensation, with newspaper reporters and curiosity seekers flocking to the small Michigan courtroom. Sheriff Briggs, now retired and gray-haired, traveled from Kansas to testify. He studied the woman carefully, comparing her features to his memories of Kate Bender. "It could be her," he admitted on the witness stand. "The resemblance is remarkable, but I cannot say with certainty that this is the same woman who escaped from the mining camp." The jury struggled with the same uncertainty. Without definitive proof, they could not convict the woman of the Bender family's crimes. Sarah Davis was released, and she disappeared once again into the anonymity of the frontier. But Sheriff Briggs never stopped believing that justice would eventually be served. In his final years, he would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Kansas prairie, still listening for the sound of approaching horses, still hoping that one day the Bender women would make the mistake that would bring them within reach of the law. He died in 1893, taking his secrets and his certainties to the grave. His tombstone bore a simple inscription: "He never stopped hunting." The Bender family's story entered American folklore, inspiring countless books, plays, and eventually motion pictures. But the truth of their fate remained elusive, lost in the vast expanse of the frontier and the shadows of time. Some historians believe they died in the mining campfire, their bodies consumed by the flames and their escape a fiction created by witnesses who couldn't accept that such evil could simply vanish. Others maintain that they survived, living out their days under assumed names in some distant territory, their killing spree finally ended by age and circumstance. But on certain nights when the wind howls across the Kansas prairie and the moon hangs low in the sky, travelers along the old roads report seeing a wagon in the distance, its canvas cover white as bone in the darkness. The wagon moves without sound, driven by figures whose faces cannot be seen, heading toward destinations that exist only in nightmare. And in the towns and settlements scattered across the frontier, people still lock their doors at night and warn their children never to trust strangers, no matter how friendly they might seem. Because somewhere in the darkness, the Bender women may still be hunting, still looking for the next victim to feed their insatiable hunger for blood and gold. The prairie keeps its secrets, and some mysteries are never meant to be solved. But the legend lives on, a reminder that evil can wear a human face and that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than most people dare to believe. In the end, the Bender family got what they wanted most: immortality. Not the kind that comes from good deeds or noble sacrifice, but the darker immortality of infamy, their names forever linked with the brutal realities of frontier life. They became part of the American story, a chapter written in blood and buried in the endless expanse of the Kansas prairie, where the wind still whispers their secrets to those brave enough to listen.